Welcome back to Moving Backwards, Episode 7. Well, it's Christmas Eve today, so what better topic to discuss than the birth story of Jesus? However, this is not going to be the traditional Christmas story that you've heard a million times, but perhaps one that you've never heard before. Because see, Jesus was a real man who was born in a real first century world to a real first century family. And biblical scholars and historians agree that the traditional birth narrative of Jesus that we hear every Christmas season does not actually hold much historical accuracy to it, and for very good reason. We know that this was clearly a narrative that developed around the 9th and 10th decade of the Common Era, and that the gospel accounts of Jesus' birth differ more dramatically than any other narrative of the Gospels differ. But this is actually what we should find the most interesting, because as we're going to see, the traditional Christmas story of Christ's birth is actually telling us a different story between the lines, one that most people have never heard before, and one that the entire fate of the Jesus story and the Christian tradition itself depended upon. Now, before we dive into this story, I want to say something first, and I want to make sure everyone hears me loud and clear. The fact that we know that the birth narrative of Jesus as described in the Gospels is mostly fable does not diminish the person of Jesus in any way whatsoever. In fact, as you're going to see in this video, it actually enhances the person of Jesus greatly. Because even though many of the famous symbols we've heard every Christmas season may not be literally true, you'll see that the whole reason human beings ascribed these symbols to the Jesus birth story is because they point us to a much deeper and more inspiring message than any literal story could ever offer us. So I encourage you not to cling to the literal interpretation and shun the symbolism, but to plunge deeply into it with me, that through the birth of Christ, God reveals his heart towards the world. And he gives us this subversive message of peace on earth and goodwill towards men, and that unto us a child is given. When we look at the Gospels, we can see just how this beautiful story begins to evolve in the narrative of Jesus about 5 or 6 decades following his death. In the Gospel of Mark, there's not only no reference to Bethlehem, but also no hint of a virgin birth. Jesus is presented as a normal Jew with no real divine essence. Historians know that it is almost certain that Nazareth was the birthplace of Jesus, since Mark and Luke both agree that this was where Jesus' parents were from. Nazareth and Bethlehem are about 100 miles apart, and so this 9 or 10-day journey would not be something a pregnant woman would have undertaken. This means that the account of a Bethlehem birthplace for Jesus did not enter the Christian tradition until Matthew's Gospel sometime in the 9th decade of the Common Era. But as the Christian movement continued forward, the Jewish opposition was saying that Jesus couldn't be the Messiah because he wasn't born in Bethlehem, since the Old Testament says that the Messiah would be born in the house of David. So the gospel writers needed to tie Jesus' birthplace to Bethlehem in order to legitimize his messianic position. When Matthew employs this Bethlehem narrative, it is clearly for the sole purpose of tying Jesus to the messianic text in Micah 5 verse 2. Now it's obvious that King Herod was a Roman who believed in pagan mythology and would have most likely not even known, let alone cared, about Jewish prophecies. However, for the sake of the virgin birth narrative, the writer of Matthew says that King Herod had his scribes search the Jewish scriptures for where this Messiah was to be born, and they found the texts in Micah which say that he will be born in Bethlehem. Now, in the birth story of Jesus, everything that has been likely added onto the original story is for the purpose of tying Jesus to the house of David and thereby legitimizing him as the Messiah in the eyes of the Jewish people. And this is not a knock on the writers for trying to be deceptive or something. On the contrary, what it says about these writers is that they were so devout and so impacted and convinced by the Jesus story that they wanted every Jewish person who likely knew these prophecies to see them as fulfilled in the person of Jesus. Now, I'm not going to get into detail on this in today's episode, but what you need to know is that in the first century, The original Christian movement was undergoing unbelievable persecution from the traditional Jewish people. They were doing everything in their power to shut down and demonize what they believed was a heretical Christ movement. So likewise, these original Christians and writers of the gospel were doing everything in their power to convince the listeners and readers of the Jesus story that their Messiah had indeed come and fulfilled the prophecies in Old Testament scripture. So they were tying Jesus to Old Testament prophecy wherever they could. And the fact remains that if they had not done this, then Christianity as we know it today may very likely not even exist. And so the Christmas story that we have today is in fact the evidence of the very first Christians living 2,000 years ago, giving their lives to both spread and legitimize this good news, that our Messiah has indeed come, and his name was Jesus. The next interesting thing to note is that the Gospel of Luke, written a decade later, also says that Jesus' birthplace was in Bethlehem, but that's about all he agrees upon with Matthew's account. Matthew tells a story in an attempt to link Jesus next to the great prophet Moses. Just like in the story of Moses, Matthew says that King Herod ordered all baby Jewish boys in Bethlehem to be killed in an attempt to kill the Jewish Messiah that was to be born there. This is of course exactly what Pharaoh did in the Old Testament story of Moses. This would have undoubtedly been an act that history would have recorded somewhere, yet there is no trace of this mass infant genocide at Bethlehem in Roman or Jewish history. The mass killing of innocent babies is not something that history allows to go ignored. However, Luke tells an entirely different story than Matthew tells in an attempt to link Jesus' birthplace to Bethlehem. Unlike Matthew, who says that Jesus' parents were from Bethlehem, Luke and Mark both agree that they were from Nazareth, which is also the very likely place of Jesus' actual birth. So in order to get his parents over to Bethlehem, Luke says that Caesar Augustus orders a census to be taken and that everyone must return to their ancestral home in order to register in it. And this was a much more ingenious solution than Matthew tells in order to solve the Bethlehem problem. Luke says that this census occurred when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Roman records show that Quirinius became governor of Syria in the winter when 6 AD turned to 7 AD. This is something the writer of Luke probably wouldn't have known. So if Jesus was born when Herod was still king in the year 4 BC, he would have been about 11 years old when Quirinius became governor in the first place. Luke also says that Jesus' parents did not flee from King Herod to Egypt, as Matthew writes, but that they stayed there for 8 days to perform Jesus' circumcision. If there was an infant genocide happening, as Matthew states, Jesus would have been long gone before those 8 days were over. So again, what this historical contradiction reveals to us is that this story was a powerful messianic narrative that early Christians were trying to tell in an attempt to legitimize the story of Jesus. If their Jewish opposition could hold the argument that Jesus did not fulfill the prophecies of the Old Testament, which they were indeed saying during that time, then the Jesus movement would have never gotten off the ground. These rich narratives were designed to make a powerful point about who the writer believed Jesus was. And now we come to the virgin birth. Now it should come as no surprise to anybody that in the ancient Jewish world, sex was seen as an unclean act that's basically only necessary for procreation. In Jewish law, a person was only committed to perform this unclean act with their spouse in private, and if they had ever been caught committing this act outside the bonds of marriage, then they would likely be put to death for adultery. So needless to say, to picture God's Messiah being born of this unclean act was clearly out of the picture for the early Christians. This is why many famous deified figures throughout history are also said to have been born of a virgin. This was a very common theme in the ancient world, and one that was absolutely required if you were going to claim deity for anyone. Interestingly, there's no mention of Jesus' virgin birth story until the mid-9th decade of the Common Era, when Matthew writes his account. This is further verified by the fact that there was also no mention of Jesus' divine birth in all the Pauline epistles, which are written between 50 and 64 AD. The only place where Paul speaks of Jesus' origin, he simply says that he was born of a woman, born under the law. If Paul had known about Jesus' divine virgin birth, he would have surely mentioned it in his writings. What Paul is saying is that Jesus was one of us, born of a woman, born under the law like every other Jew. In order to create the virgin birth narrative, Matthew makes a big stretch in quoting an Old Testament passage in an attempt to ground the story of Jesus' virgin birth in the Hebrew Scriptures. He quotes the passage in Isaiah 7:14, which says, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son." But he offers a Greek translation of the original Aramaic verse. The word virgin is not in the original Hebrew, but the word woman. And Matthew would have likely known what a stretch this was to make, since the prophecy in Isaiah was concerning the nation of Judah, which was under siege. The king of Judah was looking for a sign that God would not let them be wiped out by Assyria. Isaiah offers this prophecy to the king of Judah as a sign that God would not allow Judah to fall to the Assyrians. To say this prophecy was not given for this time of crisis that Isaiah was directing it to, but rather for something that would transpire 800 years later, is quite a stretch to say the least. And there's even records of 2nd century Jewish writers who were critiquing Matthew's connection of this Isaiah prophecy to Jesus as being false for this very reason. And this again shows us the genius of the early gospel writers in using the Jewish leaders' own religion against them to legitimize their Messiah in the eyes of the Jewish people, which we know historically worked exceptionally well. And now we come to the shepherds and the 3 wise men. Now, the 3 magi are only mentioned in Matthew's account, while Mark and Luke make no mention of them. So Matthew says that a great star from the east moves across the sky slowly enough so that these 3 wise men can follow it all the way to Jesus' manger and worship him. And now, in an ancient world that constantly looked to the stars for divine messages, this would have been a very keen strategy to validate Jesus' birth story with. And in the ancient worldview, the sky was seen as the roof of earth and the floor of heaven. This was something called the firmament, and the stars were believed to be holes in the firmament where the light of heaven would shine through, and that God would use these stars to write symbolic messages to his people down below. In the interpretive tradition of the rabbis, a star was said to have announced the birth of Abraham, Isaac, and Moses. But we know now that stars don't move across the sky because they are millions of light years away from Earth. Furthermore, they aren't small lights that can hover over a town in Jerusalem, but giant balls of burning gas many hundreds of times the size of our planet. The writer of Matthew, of course, did not know this yet. And yet the story of the Star of Bethlehem points beyond itself to a much deeper truth behind the literal view, which is that even the powers of heaven above were conspiring to grace the world with this gift of love that would forever change the course of mankind. It should be obvious to us that nobody stands outside of a great person's birthplace waiting to herald their arrival, because nobody knows who's going to be a great world-changing person until long after they're gone. So if we look at the Jesus birth story through a historical lens, then it's no doubt that many of these motifs were added to his story many decades later in order to enhance and validate this growing Christian movement. And so the true miracle of the Christmas story is that Jesus, who would one day revolutionize the world and shift the collective consciousness of humanity forever, was born in a small country town called Nazareth, with no choir of angels singing for him, with no traveling stars or magi coming to worship him and bring him gifts. Jesus was born where nobody was looking, where nobody knew he was anointed or special. He didn't arrive in New York City, but in a small truck stop town with one stoplight. Jesus, from his birth to his death, was humble, meek, and mild. And so the Christmas message is that God doesn't need a king's throne or a royal lineage, as human wisdom would suppose. He doesn't announce his entrance with choirs of angels and trumpets blaring. But he comes where no one expects or predicts, as a lowly carpenter from a little town called Nazareth. He subverts the wisdom of men by taking the lowest seat at the table. God always hides out where only humble hearts will see him. And in the Jesus story, we see that God can move anywhere, anytime, through anybody, and usually where we least expected him to. So what this says to us is, lay down your arrogance of assuming that you know how God speaks. Because the moment you think that you know, then you become like the Pharisee who says, "What good can come out of Nazareth?" And so the birth of Jesus heralds an entirely new idea about God's intention towards us. Not of wrath, anger, or judgment as we supposed, but good tidings of great joy, of peace on earth and goodwill towards men.
Jesus, Lord, at thy birth, silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright, round yon virgin mother and child, holy infant, so tender and mild, sleep in heavenly peace, sleep in heavenly